Content warning. This story includes references to domestic abuse and may be distressing to some viewers. When the line of bikes rolled into Maple Ridge, the town felt them before it saw them, a low, steady rumble that moved through the streets like distant thunder. Chrome flashed under the morning sun. Leather sighed as helmets came off. People on porches straightened. The diner's bell tinkled in a way that seemed louder than usual. Inside, Mara moved between booths with the practiced calm of someone who had learned to make ordinary mornings smooth. She poured coffee with hands that rarely trembled in public. She refilled sugar bowls and slid plates toward strangers with small automatic kindnesses. Her smile was practiced too, soft at the edges, quick to hide what needed hiding. A pale shadow at the jaw caught the light when she looked up to take an order. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing someone noticed only if they were looking for it. Rex Malone was looking. Rex watched from the booth nearest the window, one boot on the vinyl bench, one elbow on the table. He had been the kind of man who read signs for a living. How someone avoided eye contact, how a laugh arrived late, how a hand halting over a sleeve. He led the Ridge Riders with a quiet that made most people assume his strength lived in other places. They thought they knew what that strength was. He'd carried assumptions with him for years, a weight that sat like a smooth pebble in his pocket. Old mistakes, too late apologies, a handful of choices he'd replayed at night until they lost their edges and became a dull ache. The diner manager, a man who liked his authority served hot with the eggs, had already begun. He made jokes that landed like pebbles thrown into a still pool, small splashes that made fragile circles. He asked Mara about a missed order in a tone that suggested she should be grateful for the work and quieter in her mistakes. He leaned on her in ways that were meant to keep her in place, a public correction dressed as efficiency. The room let it happen. Some patrons glanced away. Some pretended not to hear. The Ridge Riders, a dozen helmets lined up like punctuation marks, watched the exchange. The leader watched and felt the pebble in his pocket press. He could have let it be. He could have shrugged and ridden away with the rest, letting rumor and tolerance and habit stitch everything back together. He had done that before, sat on the sidelines and told himself it was none of his business. Today, when the manager's voice found a small, cruel edge, Rex felt a thin, steady anger that wasn't theatrical. It was an authorization, a permission he hadn't given himself before. He stood. His movement was small enough to go unnoticed by anyone not looking for it. A chair scraped, the leather jacket creaked, and he crossed the diner. He did not storm or shout. He did not pull anyone by the collar or break something as a punctuation mark.
What he brought with him was a presence, unmissable because it was measured. "You run your place how you like," he said to the manager, voice low enough that the worst of the town's gossip had to lean in to overhear. "But you don't make people feel small to prove you're big." It wasn't a line for the movies. There was no roar. There was only the manager's mouth opening and closing, the room holding its breath, and Mara stilling with a plate halfway to a table. The manager's face flushed, not from shame so much as from being exposed, where his act had been the sort that only worked behind a curtain of indifference. He tried a retort, sharp, reflexive, but it sounded thin. The social props he'd relied on, audience, embarrassment, a code of knowing glances, fell away under the steady calm of Rex's gaze. Facing a dozen helmets parked across the sidewalk, and a man who had a reputation for making his presence count without spectacle, the manager's confidence buckled. He backed down with a muttered line about operational standards and left the room to fetch plates or take a phone call or anything that would let him out of the quiet. Nobody cheered. There was no applause. The town did not erupt. The bell above the door clicked on its hinge, and the coffee continued to steam. But Mara's shoulders dropped in a way that was not surrender so much as finally finding a place to put the weight she'd been carrying for a long time. A napkin appeared in Rex's hand when he sat back down, folded and offered without question. "For you," he said. No pity, no lecture. Mara's eyes met his. The guardedness that had been an invisible armor loosened by a fraction. She accepted the napkin, and for a moment, everything in her face was only human. A laugh that bordered on a sob, a blink that released pressure. It was not the kind of rescue that removes agency. It was an extension of a hand across a counter, a simple permission to breathe. If this kind of ordinary courage matters to you, stay with this story. What happened after that did not fit the town's scripts. There was no grand showdown, no cinematic violence, no headline-ready revenge. The Ridge Riders left their cookies of mystery intact. They did not ride into someone's yard with torches. Instead, they turned attention towards small, sustained acts that had a cumulative force all their own. Rex did what he could without speaking much about it. He asked the club's members to help in ways that did not announce themselves with flags. They organized rides for those who needed to get to a shelter intake. They pooled a modest fund to cover a month's rent or a security deposit when someone needed a place to go. They offered quietly to cover shifts at the diner when Mara needed a morning off, and to send a few of them, steady hands, not showy ones, to drive a woman to a meeting with a counselor or a doctor if she asked. The riders' gestures were practical and unglamorous. They bought groceries for a neighbor whose bills were in temporary disarray. They fixed a broken porch step that had been a hazard for months. They clipped coupons and put together meal boxes. It was the opposite of spectacle. These were the small repairs that let ordinary life continue without friction. Some people in town complained. Others whispered that the riders were showing off or buying themselves forgiveness. A few worried that giving them credit would let them off the hook for things they had done in past years. Rex heard the skepticism. He had not expected absolution. He did not want it. He wanted to do what could be done, and to be held accountable for his limits, too. Mara's path forward was not dramatic. She began to come in later some days. She started to tuck a portion of tips into a particular envelope, a small ritual that made saving feel less like a fantasy and more like a habit. She accepted rides sometimes and refused them other times. There were mornings when she took a breath at the diner door and turned back into the cool air, listening to the town for a decision she hadn't learned how to make instantly. Saying no became a muscle she practiced in private. A curt "I can't" over the phone. An "I'm not working tonight" text that felt like a spoken sentence in a language she was relearning. Rex learned what accountability looked like beyond a headline. He dropped off a bag of groceries now and then without fanfare. He left a note folded into the envelope where Mara kept her tips. Nothing more than a line, "Take your time," and his name. Those notes could have read like claims of ownership if he'd let them, but instead they were small bookmarks in a long story. He checked in, not to manage her, but to ask whether the help they were offering was useful or intrusive. He wanted to know whether his club's actions were centering Mara or centering the riders, and he listened when she said no and when she said yes. The town changed in tiny increments. A neighbor who had always gotten impatient with Mara's late arrivals now asked if she needed a minute before a shift. The diner's regulars stopped making the manager's jokes that had once been tolerated as icebreakers. A woman who used to look away when she crossed the street found herself offering to cover an evening shift, and then later, awkwardly, to teach Mara how to file an application online. People did what they could, awkwardly, tentatively, imperfectly, but over months those small things added up. That was the unbelievable part. Not that a biker gang fought someone in the street. Not that Rex staged a dramatic redemption.
The surprise lay in the conversion of a feared group into a practical, moral resource, not by grand declarations, but by a steady communal realignment. People who had been used to looking the other way started to look. Fear, habit, and shame gave ground to small choices repeated. There were setbacks. The manager was not gone forever. He resurfaced with a different brand of civility that sometimes felt performative. Mara had nights when sleep did not come, and mornings when doors felt like thresholds to be negotiated. The fund the riders set up ran thin sometimes. A few members complained that charity wasn't the club's job. Rex argued that decency was part of leadership, and leadership was the part of being in a position of influence that mattered most. Mara used the breathing room to make practical changes. She applied for a job at a cafe in the next town that opened earlier and required less interaction with the manager who had bullied her. She took a class at the community college, an evening bookkeeping course that she said she took mostly to prove she could. She learned to say no with a voice that grew steadier the more she used it. Her recovery was a rope of small steps. Opening a savings account, finding an apartment with a landlord who asked for references and then trusted them, letting herself accept a night shift covered by a neighbor without apologizing. Rex never tried to rewrite his past. He did not try to become a paragon. He continued to carry the pebble in his pocket, but it changed shape over the months. Sometimes it was more of an anchor, sometimes a reminder. He kept his presence measured. He did errands. He made himself available when asked. When he wrote notes, they were short. When he spoke to Mara, it was as an equal, never a savior. There were times when his guilt threatened to take the lead in his motives. He checked that, publicly and privately, by making sure the rider's help was requested and useful, not imposed. Months later, when the river of time had smoothed some of the rougher stones in their days, there was a quiet morning that looked like so many others. The riders were lined up outside as usual, helmets neat, chrome reflecting a mild sky. Mara walked by the diner on her way to a new early shift, hair pulled back, a reusable bag at her elbow. She saw Rex near the window. He saw her. No speeches, no cameras. She nodded, the kind of small, deliberate nod people use to communicate respect without performance. He returned the nod with his own small movement, fingers lifting in a practiced half salute. It was not an ending. It was not even forgiveness wrapped in a tidy bow. It was a mutual recognition, two people who had shared a moment that mattered, neither of them claiming to have finished a story. The town kept changing. Some people continued to argue about motives. Others used the change to re-examine how they had tolerated small cruelties in the past. The riders kept doing what they could, modestly, imperfectly. Mara continued to set boundaries and to rebuild a life on her terms. The unbelievable thing was moral rather than cinematic. It was the way a group known more for intimidation than tenderness could, by one measured intervention and a steady follow-through, become part of a solution that honored someone's agency. It was the way a community that had once hushed itself into complicity learned in small increments to hold each other accountable. If this story finds you, remember a few quiet truths. Seeing is not always acting, but it can be the start. Action need not be heroic to be meaningful. Help matters most when it respects the person it intends to serve. If this resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that ordinary courage changes things. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic abuse, consider reaching out to local resources or a national hotline for support. Those services can offer guidance and options suited to individual situations.
This story is not a map to a guaranteed outcome. It's a reminder that small, persistent acts from a community, done thoughtfully and without spectacle, can open a path for someone to reclaim their life.